You are already inside it before you realize anything has begun. Because the moment you call reality out there, something quiet has already shaped the way you will see it. And that shaping does not come from the world itself. It comes from you, from a place so familiar that you rarely question it. A place that has been choosing the meaning of everything long before you ever thought you were reacting to it. I am not asking you to believe anything yet. I am asking you to notice something that has been happening your entire life. Something so consistent that it has become invisible. Like breathing. Like the background hum of existence that you stopped hearing because it never turns off. And yet everything depends on it. Look closely at any moment you can remember. Not the event itself, but the way it felt to you. The way it unfolded through your perception. And you will begin to see that what mattered was never the situation alone. It was the interpretation that rose within you almost instantly, shaping the direction of what came next, guiding your reactions, your expectations, even the responses of others in ways that felt natural, inévitable, as if things could not have happened any other way. This is where the hidden law begins to reveal itself, not as an abstract concept, but as a living mechanism you have always been using without realizing it. Because reality does not arrive fully formed and independent of you. It meets you halfway. And what it meets is not your words, not your surface thoughts, but the deeper pattern of what you quietly assume to be true. You may think that your life is shaped by circumstances, by timing, by other people, by chance. But if you trace any repeating experience far enough, you will find something underneath it. Two, 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 two. A quiet expectation, a subtle emotional signature that precedes the event itself. Almost like a template waiting to be filled. I want you to consider something carefully, not as an idea to accept, but as something to test against your own memory, your own lived experience. What if the world you see is not fixed in the way you have been taught? What if it behaves more like a mirror, not reflecting your appearance, but reflecting your inner state, your assumptions, your unseen convictions about what is possible, what is likely, and what is allowed to happen to you? If that is true, then everything changes, not because the world becomes unstable, but because you begin to understand that the stability you trusted was never in the outer world to begin with. It was in the pattern within you that kept producing the same kinds of outcomes, again and again, in slightly different forms. Think about the moments when things seemed to just happen to you, when opportunities appeared or disappeared, when people responded in ways that felt strangely predictable, when situations unfolded with a familiarity you could not quite explain. And notice how often those moments aligned with how you were already feeling, already expecting, already leaning internally. This is not coincidence in the way you were taught to understand it. This is coherence, a matching between inner pattern and outer experience that happens so seamlessly it feels like reality is leading and you are following, when in truth the direction was set much earlier, in a place you were not watching. I am speaking to you directly now, because this is where the idea becomes personal, not philosophical, not theoretical, but immediate. Because if reality is a mirror, then you are not standing outside of it. You are inside the very mechanism that is generating what you see. And that means every reaction you have, every assumption you hold, every identity you quietly accept is participating in the construction of your experience in real time. You do not need to control every thought. You do not need to force anything into existence. But you do need to become aware of the underlying pattern that is already shaping everything. Because that pattern does not shout, it does not demand attention, it simply repeats, over and over, until you either recognize it or continue living inside it as if it were the only reality available. There is a reason this knowledge has always been described as hidden, not because it was locked away, but because it requires a certain kind of seeing, a willingness to look beyond appearances and notice the connection between what you feel, what you expect, and what unfolds. And most people never pause long enough to see that connection clearly. You are pausing now, even if only slightly, and that is enough to begin. Imagine standing in front of a mirror that does not show your face, but shows the state you carry within you. Not what you say you want, but what you actually assume to be true. And imagine that this mirror is not passive. It is active, constantly translating that inner state into the events, interactions, and conditions of your life. You would not try to change the reflection by touching the surface of the mirror. You would understand that the change must occur at the source, at the level of what is being reflected. And yet, in everyday life, you have been taught to do the opposite, to fight the reflection, to fix the surface, to adjust the external without ever addressing the internal pattern that continues to reproduce it. This is why effort alone often fails, why trying harder does not always create different results. Because effort applied to the reflection cannot override the pattern that is generating it. But something subtle begins to shift the moment you see this clearly. Not intellectually, but directly. Because once you recognize that the world is responding to your inner state, you start to notice the small moments where that state appears before the event, where the feeling comes first, where the expectation quietly forms, and you realize that you are not reacting as late as you thought you were. You are earlier than you believed, and being earlier changes everything, because it places you at the point where reality is still forming, still flexible, still responding, not after it has already solidified into something that feels fixed and unchangeable. This is not about controlling life. It is about understanding your place within it, understanding that you are not separate from what you experience, and that what you call reality is not something happening to you, but something unfolding through a continuous interaction between your inner world and the field that reflects it back. Stay with that, not as a conclusion, but as something unfinished, something still opening. Because the moment you begin to see reality as a mirror, you also begin to notice how often you have been looking at the reflection without ever questioning the source that created it. You do not become the architect of your reality at some distant moment in the future. You have been designing it all along, quietly, continuously, through the patterns you have accepted as true, through the assumptions you rarely question, through the identity you return to again and again, without noticing that it is shaping everything you touch. What changes now is not your role, but your awareness of it. I want you to look at something simple, something you may have dismissed before because it seemed too ordinary to matter, the way you expect things to go before they even begin, the subtle leaning of your mind toward a certain outcome, not always spoken, not always fully formed, but present nonetheless, like a background current guiding the direction of your experience. That current is not neutral, and it is not random. It carries the imprint of what you believe is possible for you, what you believe is likely, what you believe you deserve, and the world, in ways that feel almost invisible, organizes itself around that imprint with a precision that can be mistaken for coincidence if you are not paying close enough attention. You have seen this before, even if you did not name it. Moments where everything seemed to confirm what you already suspected, where interactions unfolded exactly along the lines you anticipated, where opportunities appeared or vanished in ways that matched your inner expectations so closely it almost felt scripted. And perhaps you thought, that is just how things are. That is just how life works. But what if that is not how life works in general? What if that is how life works through you? Let me tell you something, not as a story to entertain you, but as a mirror you may recognize yourself within. There was a woman who worked with her hands, shaping patterns into fabric day after day, and at some point her work began to lose its vitality, not because her skill had faded, but because something in her had shifted, something quieter than technique, something deeper than effort, a belief that what she offered was no longer valuable in a world that felt crowded and indifferent. She did not announce this belief. She did not write it down or declare it openly, but it lived in the way she approached her work, in the slight hesitation before beginning, in the subtle doubt that accompanied each decision, and over time, the world responded, not to her words, but to that quiet assumption. Fewer people noticed her work, fewer opportunities came. The patterns she created began to reflect the same lack of energy she felt within, until it seemed as if reality itself had turned against her. But reality had not turned, it had aligned. One morning, in a moment that did not seem extraordinary at first, she encountered someone who saw her more clearly than she was seeing herself, someone who did not offer advice in the usual sense, but asked a question that lingered long after the conversation ended. If what you see is shaped by how you look, then what happens when you change the way you are looking? That question did not produce an immediate transformation. It did something more subtle. It created a gap in her certainty, a space where a different possibility could begin to exist. And in that space, she started to observe. She noticed how often she anticipated rejection before it occurred, how frequently she assumed that her work would go unnoticed, how naturally she leaned toward disappointment even before anything had happened. And once she saw that pattern, she could no longer pretend it was coming from the outside. This is where you begin to awaken as the architect, not by forcing change, not by trying to control every outcome, but by recognizing the blueprint you have been using unconsciously, because the blueprint is not in your actions, it is in your assumptions. Two people can take the same action and receive entirely different responses from the world, not because the world is inconsistent, but because it is responding to something deeper than the action itself, something that cannot be seen from the outside, but can be felt in the quality of presence, in the certainty or doubt carried beneath the surface. When she began to shift that inner blueprint, not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually, deliberately, something unexpected happened. Her work changed, not in technique, but in essence. There was a different energy in it, a quiet confidence that did not need to announce itself, and people began to respond in ways that felt almost surprising, as if the world had suddenly become more receptive, more open, more aligned with her efforts. But nothing external had initiated that shift. It had begun within her, at the level of what she believed was true. I am speaking to you in the same way now, because this is not her story. It is a pattern that exists wherever belief and experience meet, and it is active in your life, whether you acknowledge it or not. The universe does not respond to what you say you want. It responds to what you assume is already real. That distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Wanting implies distance, implies absence, implies that what you desire is somewhere outside of you, not yet yours, not fully accessible. And when that assumption is held consistently, the world reflects it by keeping what you want just out of reach, close enough to see, but not close enough to hold. Assuming, on the other hand, carries a different tone. It does not reach. It does not chase. It rests in a quiet knowing that does not need to prove itself. And from that state, reality begins to reorganize, not because you forced it, but because you aligned with a different blueprint. You are not learning to manipulate the world. You are learning to recognize the structure through which it responds to you. Every belief you hold is not just an idea. It is a directive, a pattern that informs the field of experience, how to arrange itself around you. And the more consistently that belief is held, the more stable the resulting pattern becomes. This is why change can feel difficult, not because it is impossible, but because you are not only shifting a thought, you are shifting a structure that has been reinforced over time. But the moment you see it, truly see it, something loosens. You begin to notice the space between what happens and what you assume about it. You begin to sense the possibility of choosing differently, not in a forced or artificial way, but in a way that feels like stepping into a slightly different version of yourself, one who does not default to the same conclusions, one who allows for a different outcome before it has a chance to form. This is the beginning of conscious creation, not control, not force, not constant effort, but awareness applied at the level where experience begins to take shape. Stay with that awareness, not as something you have mastered, but as something that is quietly unfolding, because the moment you recognize yourself as the architect, even partially, you can no longer fully believe that reality is something being handed to you from the outside. You can spend years trying to understand why certain things in your life repeat, why effort does not always translate into results, why two people can do the same thing and arrive at completely different outcomes. And yet the answer does not sit where you have been trained to look for it, because it is not hidden in strategy or timing or external conditions. It exists in something far more immediate. Something you have been carrying into every moment without realizing it is shaping what follows. Before anything happens, before any conversation unfolds, or any opportunity appears or disappears, there is already a tone within you, a quiet emotional atmosphere that does not need to be spoken, that does not announce itself. Yet it sets the direction of what is about to take place with a precision that feels almost invisible unless you begin to watch for it deliberately. This is where the law beneath laws begins to reveal itself, not as an idea to believe, but as a pattern you can observe directly. Because what you feel is not simply a reaction to reality. It is part of the mechanism that produces it, a form of resonance that selects which version of reality becomes available to you in that moment. There was a man who worked with delicate systems, mechanisms so intricate that even the smallest imbalance would disrupt the entire structure. And he believed his success depended entirely on focus and precision, on controlling each movement with care. Yet something kept interfering with that belief, because there were days when everything resisted him despite his effort, when parts misaligned, when simple processes became complicated, and other days when the same work unfolded with a strange ease, as if the system itself was cooperating with him rather than opposing him. At first, he searched for technical explanations, adjusting his tools, examining his environment, refining his methods, but none of it accounted for the inconsistency. And only when he began to notice his own state before beginning his work did something start to make sense. Because on the days when tension had already settled into him, when a quiet frustration was present beneath his focus, the work seemed to mirror that tension in ways he could not control. While on the days when his attention was calm and steady, when there was no internal resistance, the same systems responded differently, almost as if they were aligned with him instead of against him. Nothing external had changed, yet the outcome had shifted completely. And that shift was not random. It followed the emotional tone he carried into the moment. You have experienced this yourself, even if you have never named it clearly. Moments when everything seemed to flow without effort, when people responded easily, when timing aligned in ways that felt natural, and other moments when the same actions created friction, misunderstanding, delay, as if something unseen was redirecting the outcome before it fully formed. The difference was not in what you did, it was in what you felt before you did it. This is why forcing results often produces the opposite of what you intend. Because when action is driven by urgency, by lack, by a sense of needing something to happen, the signal beneath that action carries tension, and that tension is what the world responds to. Not the words you say, not even the actions you take, but the underlying state that gives those actions their meaning. You can say you want success while feeling uncertainty. You can say you want connection while expecting rejection, and in both cases, the result will follow the feeling rather than the statement. Because the field you're interacting with does not interpret language the way your mind does. It aligns with coherence, with the dominant tone that is consistent within you. This is not about suppressing emotion or pretending to feel something different, because anything forced remains unstable. It is about recognizing that what you sustain emotionally becomes the filter through which reality is organized, the lens that determines what you notice, what responds to you, what becomes possible in a tangible way. There was a traveler crossing a harsh landscape who spent his days focused on difficulty, on lack, on the resistance of the path itself. And with each step, the journey seemed to confirm his perception, until something shifted in him, not dramatically, but subtly, a willingness to notice what he had been overlooking. Small signs of life, hidden paths, variations in the terrain that had always been there, but had remained invisible to a mind tuned only to struggle. And as that shift deepened, the experience of the journey changed, not because the land transformed, but because he was no longer resonating with the same layer of it. What you experience is not the entirety of reality. It is the portion that matches your state, selected continuously through a process so immediate that it feels like reality is fixed, when in truth it is highly responsive to the tone you maintain. Your emotional state is not contained within you. It extends into your experience as a shaping force, influencing what aligns, what resists, what becomes available. And because this happens without pause, it creates the illusion that life is happening to you, when in fact you are participating in the selection of what unfolds at every moment. The question is not whether this process is real. It is whether you are aware of it while it is happening, because awareness does not instantly change everything, but it changes where you stand in relation to what is unfolding. It allows you to notice the tone before the outcome, to recognize the direction before it fully materializes. And in that recognition, something opens that was not available before. You begin to sense that what you feel is not separate from what you experience, and that the world you move through is not as fixed as it once appeared, but responsive in ways that only become visible when you stop looking at the result and start noticing the state that quietly came before it. You rarely notice where your attention rests until something pulls it sharply in a different direction. Yet the quiet truth is that wherever your awareness settles, something begins to gather there. Not instantly, not in a way that announces itself, but gradually, persistently, as if reality itself is taking cues from what you continue to observe and amplifying it until it becomes undeniable. You may believe that attention is passive, that you are simply noticing what is already present. But what if noticing is not neutral? What if it is the very act that feeds, strengthens, and multiplies whatever it touches, shaping the structure of your experience in ways that feel natural only because you have never questioned the mechanism behind them? I want you to consider how often your attention moves without your permission, drawn toward what is familiar, toward what confirms what you already believe, toward what carries emotional weight, whether that weight is pleasant or not. Because attention does not discriminate based on what you want. It follows intensity, repetition, and habit. And wherever it goes, it leaves a kind of imprint, a reinforcement that makes the same pattern more likely to appear again. This is not because the world is changing randomly around you, but because you are consistently energizing certain aspects of it while leaving others unfed. And over time, what is nourished grows in presence, while what is ignored fades into the background of your awareness as if it never existed. There was a woman who spent her days working with fine detail, creating patterns that required patience and precision. Yet she developed a habit she did not recognize at first, a tendency to focus on what was imperfect in her work, a small misalignment, a thread slightly out of place, a detail that did not meet her expectation. And as her attention returned to these imperfections again and again, something began to shift, not in the material itself, but in her perception of it, because the more she looked for flaws, the more they seemed to appear, until it felt as though her work had become filled with errors that were not there before. What changed was not the work, but the direction of her awareness, and that direction quietly shaped what became visible to her when she was guided, not by force but by suggestion, to look differently, to deliberately notice what was already working, the balance, the symmetry, the beauty that had always been present but overlooked. Something equally subtle began to occur, because the same work started to reveal a different character, a coherence that had not vanished but had simply been ignored. And as her attention stabilized on what she wished to see, the patterns she created began to reflect that stability, as if the act of observing had become a form of influence rather than mere recognition. This is where the code of attention begins to unfold, not as a technique to apply mechanically, but as a principle that has always been active in your life, because what you give sustained awareness to does not remain unchanged. It organizes itself. It expands. It becomes more prominent in your experience, not only because you notice it more, but because your attention acts as a form of nourishment, a signal that directs the field of experience to bring more of the same into alignment with you. You have seen this when a single thought lingers and begins to shape your mood, when a concern grows simply because it is revisited repeatedly, when a small appreciation deepens into a broader sense of ease because you allowed your attention to rest there long enough for it to take root. It may seem that the world is presenting you with fixed conditions that you then respond to, but if you look more carefully, you will notice that your attention is already selecting what becomes dominant within those conditions, amplifying certain details while minimizing others, creating a version of reality that feels complete even though it is only a partial expression of what is available. This selection happens continuously, shaping not only what you perceive but how you feel, and how you feel then feeds back into what you continue to notice, creating a loop that reinforces itself until it appears unchangeable. You do not need to control every moment of attention, and trying to do so would only create tension, but you can begin to notice where it rests by default, where it returns when left unattended, because those places reveal the patterns you have been reinforcing without intention. When you see that clearly, something subtle shifts. Because attention that is unconscious repeats. But attention that becomes aware introduces the possibility of choice, not forced, not abrupt, but gradual, like adjusting the direction of a current rather than trying to stop it entirely. There was a gardener who discovered this in a way that seemed almost too simple to matter. A single plant in the corner of her garden had begun to wither, and for days she focused on its decline, noticing the dryness of its leaves, the weakness of its stem, and each time she returned to it, it seemed to confirm her concern, until she decided, not out of certainty but out of curiosity, to sit beside it and give her attention differently, to observe its remaining vitality, the subtle strength still present, the possibility of growth rather than the evidence of decay. She did not change the soil or the water immediately. She changed the quality of her attention, and over time, the plant responded in a way that surprised her, not because attention alone replaced care, but because the direction of her awareness influenced how she engaged with it, how consistently she supported it, how she interacted with the process of its recovery. This is not about magical thinking. It is about recognizing that attention is not separate from action. It precedes it, shapes it, determines how you move, what you prioritize, what you reinforce. And because of that, it becomes a force that participates directly in the creation of your experience. When you persistently attend to lack, you become more attuned to it, more sensitive to its presence, more likely to interpret situations through its lens. And in doing so, you align with patterns that confirm it. When you steadily direct attention toward what is working, what is possible, what is already aligned, you begin to engage with a different layer of reality, one that was always available but required a different focus to become visible. You are not forcing reality to change through attention. You are selecting which version of it you participate in, and that selection becomes stronger the more consistently your awareness rests in the same direction. This is why scattered attention produces scattered results, while sustained attention creates coherence. Not instantly, but inevitably, because what is repeatedly observed becomes stabilized in your experience. As you begin to see this, not as a concept, but as a process unfolding in real time, you may notice moments where your attention shifts before your experience does, where the internal change precedes the external one. And in those moments, something becomes clear that was not obvious before. That awareness itself is not just observing reality. It is one of the primary forces through which reality takes shape, quietly, continuously, responding to where you place it even when you are not consciously choosing it. You have felt it before in moments that did not announce themselves as important. A subtle knowing that arrived before thought had time to organize itself. A quiet impulse that did not argue or explain, yet carried a sense of certainty that felt different from guessing, different from reasoning, almost as if something within you had already seen what your mind had not yet reached. And if you are honest, you will remember that when you followed it, things often unfolded with an ease that felt strangely aligned. And when you dismissed it, events sometimes moved in directions that later made you pause and wonder when exactly you had overlooked what was already clear. This is not coincidence in the way you were taught to interpret it. And it is not imagination, in the dismissive sense you may have learned to apply. Because what you call intuition does not originate from the same layer of mind that produces thoughts. It arises from a deeper field of awareness, one that is not limited to linear time, not confined to what you have already experienced, but connected to patterns that extend beyond what you can consciously track. And for that reason, it often appears quiet, indirect, almost easy to ignore if you are accustomed to relying only on what can be explained. I want you to consider how quickly your mind moves to override that signal, how often you replace a simple knowing with analysis, how naturally you question what does not come with a reason attached, because you have been trained to trust what can be justified, what can be broken down and examined. Yet intuition does not operate that way. It does not present evidence. It does not build arguments. It simply appears, complete in itself, and waits to be recognized or dismissed. There was a man who traveled between distant places, making decisions each day that shaped not only his path, but his survival. And over time he began to notice a pattern that did not fit into his understanding of cause and effect. Moments where a quiet hesitation would arise before a choice, not strong enough to command him, but present enough to be felt, and when he ignored it, the journey became more difficult, obstacles appearing where he had not anticipated them, while on the rare occasions when he allowed that hesitation to guide him, even without understanding why, the path seemed to open in ways that felt almost deliberate. At first, he attributed these experiences to luck, to chance, to factors he could not control, but the repetition of the pattern made that explanation insufficient. And slowly, reluctantly, he began to listen more carefully, not to the loud voice of reasoning that demanded clarity, but to the quieter current that did not need to explain itself. As he did, something shifted, not in the world around him, but in his relationship to it. Because he was no longer moving only through what he could calculate, he was responding to something that felt like guidance, not imposed from outside, but arising from within in a way that suggested a deeper connection to the unfolding of events. You have access to the same current, though you may have learned to ignore it, to silence it in favor of what appears more reliable. Yet reliability in this sense is often tied to what is familiar rather than what is accurate. And intuition rarely feels familiar at first because it does not repeat what you already know. It introduces a different direction, one that may not align with your expectations but aligns with something larger than them. Think about the moments when you knew something without knowing how you knew it, when a decision felt right before you could justify it, when a sense of caution or possibility arose without a clear source. And notice how those moments did not require effort. They did not strain your mind. They appeared almost effortlessly, as if they were being received rather than created. And this distinction matters, because it suggests that intuition is not something you produce. It is something you become aware of when the noise of constant thinking settles enough for it to be noticed. The difficulty is not that intuition is unclear, it is that it is subtle, and in a world that rewards speed, certainty, and explanation, subtle signals are often overlooked in favor of louder, more immediate forms of input. Yet those louder signals are frequently tied to fear, habit, or past conditioning, while intuition carries a different quality, one that is steady without being forceful, precise without being rigid, present without demanding attention. There was a young woman who cared for a flock in open land, and over time she developed a sensitivity to changes that others did not perceive, a feeling that would arise before weather shifted, before danger approached, before the movement of her animals changed direction, and she could not explain it in terms that satisfied others, but she learned to trust it because the consequences of ignoring it became too clear to dismiss. She was not predicting the future in a mystical sense. She was attuned to patterns that existed beneath the surface, patterns her conscious mind could not process quickly enough, but that her deeper awareness could register and translate into a simple signal she could act upon. This is what intuition does. It compresses complexity into clarity. It translates vast amounts of information into a form that does not require analysis. And in doing so, it allows you to respond to reality in a way that feels immediate, aligned, and often more accurate than decisions made solely through deliberate reasoning. You are not separate from the field of information that surrounds you. And intuition is one of the ways that connection expresses itself, not as something mystical or inaccessible, but as a natural function of awareness when it is not dominated entirely by thought. The more you rely exclusively on analysis, the more you narrow your access to what can be processed consciously. But the moment you begin to allow space for quieter forms of knowing, you expand the range of what you can perceive and respond to. This does not mean abandoning reason, but it does mean recognizing its limits, understanding that not everything can be calculated in advance, and that some forms of clarity arrive only when you are willing to trust what cannot yet be explained. Intuition is not opposed to intelligence. It is an extension of it, operating at a level that integrates more than the conscious mind can hold at once. You may begin to notice it more clearly when you pause, even briefly, before making decisions, when you allow a moment of stillness instead of rushing to conclusion, when you observe the difference between a thought that feels constructed and a knowing that feels immediate, and over time, that distinction becomes easier to recognize, not because intuition becomes louder, but because you become more attuned to it. The more you acknowledge it, the more consistent it appears, not as something that suddenly emerges, but as something that was always present, waiting for your attention to shift toward it. You do not need to force it to speak. You only need to notice when it already has, because it does not compete with your thoughts. It exists alongside them, offering a different kind of guidance that becomes meaningful only when you are willing to consider that not everything you need to know arrives in the form you were taught to trust. Stay with that awareness, not as a conclusion, but as a subtle shift in how you listen to yourself. Because the moment you begin to recognize intuition as a form of intelligence rather than an interruption to it, you step into a way of moving through reality that is less about figuring everything out and more about aligning with what is already unfolding. You do not wake up each day as a blank slate waiting for reality to define you. You wake up already carrying a version of yourself that has been quietly constructed over time. A version that does not need to announce itself because it operates beneath your awareness, guiding what you notice, what you expect, what you accept as possible, and what you dismiss before it even has a chance to fully appear. This version of you is not fixed in the way you may have been led to believe. Yet it behaves with a consistency that makes it feel permanent, as if it were an unchangeable truth rather than a pattern that has been repeated long enough to feel like identity. I want you to look at how naturally you refer to yourself, not in the words you say out loud to others, but in the quiet statements that arise within you, the ones that begin with something so simple you rarely question it. The phrase, "I am," followed by whatever you have come to accept as true, whether that truth supports you or confines you. These statements are not casual. They are not insignificant. They function as declarations that shape how reality organizes itself around you. Because what you consistently identify with becomes the lens through which every experience is filtered and interpreted. You may say you want change. You may attempt new actions, new strategies, new directions. Yet if the identity beneath those actions remains the same, the results will tend to return to familiar patterns. Not because the world is resisting you, but because the version of you that is engaging with the world is still aligned with the same assumptions. Two people can take identical steps and arrive at completely different outcomes, not because one is more deserving or more capable, but because each is operating from a different sense of self, a different internal definition of who they are and what is available to them. There was a woman who created intricate work with remarkable skill, yet she never allowed herself to fully step into the identity that matched what she was capable of. And so she moved through her days describing herself in smaller terms, not with intention, but with habit, referring to her work as ordinary, her abilities as limited, her role as secondary to others who she believed were more qualified or more deserving. The world responded to her in a way that mirrored that quiet self-definition, offering opportunities that matched her expectations, reflecting back to her the identity she continued to reinforce, until it seemed as though her circumstances were the cause of her limitations, rather than the result of them. What changed for her did not begin with external opportunity. It began with a shift that was almost invisible at first, a willingness to question the identity she had been repeating, to notice how often she defaulted to the same description of herself, how consistently she returned to the same internal narrative, and how naturally that narrative shaped what she believed she could or could not do. As she became aware of this pattern, something subtle opened, not a dramatic transformation, but a space in which a different version of herself could begin to exist. Not fully formed, not yet stable, but present enough to be recognized. This is where reprogramming identity begins, not with forcing yourself to believe something you do not yet feel, but with becoming aware of the identity you are already sustaining. Because what you are not aware of continues to operate without interruption, shaping your experience in ways that feel automatic. Once you see it, even partially, you create a point of choice. Not a rigid decision, but a shift in direction, where you can begin to introduce a different statement, a different sense of self, not as a performance, but as a possibility you are willing to explore. When you say, "I am," you are not merely describing yourself. You are defining the framework through which reality responds to you. And this definition extends beyond words into feeling, into expectation, into the subtle ways you carry yourself through situations. If you hold the sense that you are someone who is overlooked, reality will present circumstances that confirm that pattern. not because it is fixed, but because your awareness is tuned to it. If you begin to embody the sense that you are someone who is seen, valued, and aligned with opportunity, the field of experience begins to reorganize, not instantly, but consistently, reflecting that shift in ways that become more noticeable over time. This is not about pretending to be something you are not. It is about recognizing that what you are has never been as fixed as you assumed. That identity is not a rigid structure but a dynamic one, shaped by repetition, reinforced by attention, and therefore capable of being revised when awareness is applied to it deliberately. The challenge is not in creating a new identity, but in allowing it to stabilize, because the previous pattern will attempt to reassert itself through familiarity, through habit, through the comfort of what is known, even if it no longer serves you. There was a man who believed himself to be consistently unsuccessful, not because of a single event, but because of a series of experiences that he interpreted through that lens. And over time, that interpretation became identity, something he no longer questioned. Opportunities appeared, but he did not recognize them as such, or he approached them with hesitation that reflected his expectation of failure. And in doing so, he participated in the continuation of the pattern he believed was being imposed on him. When he began to shift, not his actions at first, but his internal statement, allowing himself to consider that he could be someone for whom things worked, someone aligned with success rather than separated from it. Something changed in the way he engaged with those same opportunities, and the outcomes began to differ, not because the world had changed independently, but because the version of him interacting with it had. You are not trying to convince the world of who you are. You are allowing yourself to become someone internally, and the world reflects that state as a natural consequence. The phrase, "I am," is not powerful because of its wording alone, but because of the identity it anchors, the continuity it creates between your inner state and your outer experience. Each time you return to the same definition, you reinforce it, and each time you introduce a new one with consistency, you begin to establish a different pattern that reality can respond to. This process is not immediate in the sense that everything changes at once, but it is immediate in the sense that the moment you shift your identity, you shift the trajectory of your experience. Even if the full expression of that shift unfolds over time, you begin to notice different things, respond differently, interpret events through a new lens, and these small changes accumulate, creating a version of reality that aligns with the identity you are now sustaining. Stay with that awareness, not as something you have completed, but as something that is continuing to evolve. Because the identity you hold is not a fixed destination. It is a living structure that you are participating in, whether consciously or unconsciously, and the moment you begin to engage with it deliberately, you are no longer simply reacting to reality. You are shaping the version of yourself that reality reflects back to you. You may believe your thoughts are fleeting, scattered, momentary impressions that pass without leaving structure behind. Yet if you look carefully at the patterns of your life, at the recurring shapes your experiences take, you will begin to sense that something far more organized is at work, something that does not operate randomly but follows a kind of hidden symmetry, a quiet geometry that forms beneath your awareness and then expresses itself outwardly as the circumstances you encounter. What you think is not simply content, to it is form, and that form carries a structure that reality recognizes and reproduces with a precision that often goes unnoticed because you are focused on the surface of events rather than the pattern that gave rise to them. I want you to imagine for a moment that every thought you sustain is not just a passing idea, but a shape, something with dimension and orientation, something that leaves an imprint in the field of experience, organizing possibilities around it in a way that mirrors its structure. This is not a metaphor meant to decorate the idea. It is a way of pointing to something you can begin to observe directly, because the patterns in your life are not abstract. They repeat, they echo, they carry a recognizable form that can be traced back to the way you consistently think about yourself, about others, about what is possible and what is not. There was a man who spent his days writing, carefully tracing symbols onto pages that few would ever read. And over time he developed a habit that seemed insignificant at first, a tendency to draw small patterns in the margins of his work, shapes that held no immediate meaning to him, curves, Lines, repetitions that emerged without conscious intention. As the days passed, something curious began to happen. He started noticing those same patterns appearing in places he had never paid attention to before, in the arrangement of objects in the marketplace, in the architecture of buildings, in the way people moved through space, as if the forms he had been creating internally were being reflected back to him externally, not because the world had changed, but because he had tuned himself to a particular structure that was now visible everywhere. This is how thought operates when it is sustained. It creates a kind of template, a geometric signature that organizes your perception and your experience around it. And once that template stabilizes, reality begins to mirror it in ways that feel natural, inevitable, as if things could not have unfolded any differently. You may call these patterns coincidence, but coincidence is often just structure that has not yet been recognized, a repetition that has not yet been traced back to its source. Think about the recurring themes in your own life, the situations that seem to take on a familiar shape even when the details change, the dynamics that repeat in different contexts, the outcomes that feel predictable even when you hoped they would be different. And ask yourself not why they keep happening, but what pattern they are expressing. What underlying structure is being reproduced again and again? When you begin to look at your experiences this way, not as isolated events but as manifestations of a consistent form, something becomes clearer. The source of the pattern is not outside of you. It is within the way you think, the way you organize meaning, the way you interpret and anticipate. There was a merchant who became fascinated with a particular idea, the idea of expansion, and he began to hold that idea in his mind not as a vague desire, but as a clear form, imagining growth as a spiral, something that moved outward while maintaining connection to its center. He did not fully understand why he chose that shape, but he returned to it repeatedly, visualizing it, feeling it, allowing it to become familiar. And over time, he began to notice that his business started to reflect that same pattern, customers moving through his space in ways that increased flow, opportunities emerging in a sequence that built upon itself, growth occurring not in sudden leaps but in consistent, expanding cycles that mirrored the structure he had been holding internally. This is not about drawing shapes in your mind as a technique. It is about recognizing that your thoughts already carry structure, whether you are aware of it or not. And that structure influences how reality organizes itself around you. When your thinking is vague, inconsistent, scattered, the results tend to reflect that lack of clarity. Outcomes appear fragmented, unpredictable, difficult to sustain. When your thinking becomes more defined, more coherent, more aligned with a clear internal structure, the patterns that emerge in your life begin to reflect that coherence. Not instantly, but with increasing consistency. You are not separate from the patterns you experience. You are participating in their formation at a level that is often overlooked because it does not present itself as obvious cause and effect. The geometry of thought operates beneath the surface, shaping the way possibilities align, the way events connect, the way outcomes unfold over time. And because this process is continuous, it creates the impression that reality is fixed, when in truth it is constantly organizing itself around the structures you sustain. There is a reason why clarity matters, not because it guarantees a specific result, but because it stabilizes the pattern you are projecting into the field of experience. When you hold a clear intention, not just as a statement but as a felt structure, something begins to align around it. Interactions become more relevant, opportunities more visible, decisions more intuitive, as if the geometry you are sustaining is guiding the arrangement of events in a way that reduces friction and increases coherence. This does not mean that every thought must be controlled or perfected, but it does mean that sustained patterns carry weight, that what you return to repeatedly becomes the dominant structure through which your experience is organized. You may not notice this immediately, because the effects are not always dramatic, but over time, the accumulation of these patterns becomes visible in the overall shape of your life, in the way things connect, in the way outcomes build upon each other. When you begin to see this, something shifts in how you relate to your own thinking, because it is no longer just a stream of passing ideas. It becomes a creative force with structure, with direction, with the ability to influence how reality takes form around you. You start to notice when your thoughts are reinforcing patterns you no longer wish to sustain, and you begin to introduce new structures, not through force, but through consistency, through returning again and again to a different way of organizing your inner world. The shapes you hold within your awareness are not confined to your mind. They extend into your experience, becoming the blueprint through which events are arranged. And as you refine those shapes, as you bring more clarity and coherence to the patterns you sustain, the structure of your reality begins to reflect that refinement in ways that feel less like chance and more like alignment, less like randomness and more like a quiet, unfolding order that was always present but only becomes visible when you learn to recognize the geometry behind it. Time has been presented to you as something rigid, something that moves forward at a fixed pace, regardless of how you feel, something that cannot be influenced or altered. Yet if you look honestly at your own experience, you will begin to notice that time does not always behave the way you were taught to expect, that it stretches in certain moments and collapses in others, that it feels dense when your awareness is fully present and strangely absent when your attention is scattered. And this inconsistency is not a flaw in perception. It is a clue to the deeper nature of time itself. You have lived through moments that seem to expand beyond their expected duration, moments where everything slowed down, where details became vivid, where your awareness sharpened in a way that made even a few seconds feel extended, almost suspended. And you have also experienced the opposite. Long periods that seemed to disappear without leaving a trace. Hours that passed without depth, as if they had never fully been inhabited. These differences are not random. They are directly tied to the quality of your presence, to the depth of your attention, to how fully you are engaged with the moment you are in. There was a traveler moving along a narrow mountain path when something unexpected occurred. A sudden obstruction appeared in front of him, and in that instant, something shifted, not in the environment, but in his perception, because what would normally have unfolded in a brief moment expanded into something far more detailed. He became aware of the texture of the ground beneath his feet, the movement of air around him, the subtle changes in light and shadow, all within a span of time that seemed to stretch beyond its usual limits. When the moment passed, he could not explain what had happened, but he knew that time had not felt the same. It had responded to the intensity of his awareness in a way that defied his previous understanding. This is where the elastic nature of time begins to reveal itself, not as a concept to be accepted blindly, but as something you can observe in your own life. Because time is not experienced independently of your awareness. It is shaped by it, influenced by the depth and focus of your attention. When your awareness is scattered, divided, pulled in multiple directions, time appears to move quickly, not because it is actually accelerating, but because you are not fully inhabiting it. You are passing through it without engaging deeply enough for it to register with clarity. When your awareness is concentrated, steady, present, time appears to slow, not because it has changed externally, but because you are experiencing it more fully, more completely, with greater detail and depth. You may begin to notice this in simple ways, in how time feels different when you are engaged in something that holds your full attention compared to when you are distracted, in how moments seem to expand when you are deeply involved in what you are doing and contract when your mind is elsewhere. This is not just a subjective illusion. It reflects a deeper relationship between consciousness and the flow of time, a relationship that suggests time is not as fixed as it appears, but responsive in ways that are rarely acknowledged. There was an artist who would lose herself in her work for what felt like brief periods, only to realize that hours had passed. And yet those hours did not feel long. They felt full, rich with detail, with presence, with a sense of immersion that made time feel secondary to the experience itself. In contrast, there were days when even a short span of time felt heavy, stretched in an uncomfortable way, filled with distraction and lack of engagement. The difference was not in the clock, but in her state, in how present she was with what she was doing. Time, in this sense, is not simply something you move through. It is something you participate in, something that reflects the quality of your awareness back to you. When you are fully present, you are not just observing time. You are deepening it, giving it substance, allowing each moment to unfold with clarity rather than passing unnoticed. When you are disconnected, time loses that substance. It becomes thin, less defined, slipping past without leaving the same imprint. This has implications beyond how you perceive duration, because the way you experience time influences how you engage with reality itself. When you are present, you are more attuned to what is happening, more aware of subtle shifts, more capable of responding with clarity rather than reacting out of habit. When you are not present, you move through patterns automatically, repeating responses that may no longer serve you, simply because you are not fully aware of the moment in which those responses are occurring. You may begin to notice that moments of clarity often arise when you slow down, not physically, but internally, when your attention settles, when you are not rushing ahead or dwelling on what has already passed, but fully engaged with what is here. In those moments, time feels different, not because it has stopped, but because you are no longer experiencing it as something that is moving away from you, but as something that is unfolding with you. There was a simple practice observed by those who sought to understand this relationship, a practice of focusing on a single object, not as a means of distraction, but as a way of anchoring awareness, allowing attention to rest fully on something without dividing it. As they did this, they began to notice that time seemed to expand around that focus, that the act of sustained attention created a sense of depth that was not present when their awareness was scattered. This was not about the object itself, but about the state it produced, a state in which presence became more pronounced, and time responded accordingly. The more you explore this, the more you may begin to see that time is not simply a backdrop against which events occur, but an aspect of experience that is intimately connected to how you engage with those events. It is shaped by your awareness, influenced by your presence, and responsive to the depth of your attention in ways that challenge the idea of it being entirely fixed or independent. You are not required to control time, but you can begin to understand how your experience of it changes depending on how present you are, how fully you inhabit each moment, how much of your awareness is actually here rather than divided across past and future. As you begin to notice this more clearly, something subtle shifts, because time no longer feels like something that is slipping away from you, but something that expands or contracts in response to how you meet it. Stay with that observation, not as a conclusion, but as an ongoing experience, because the more you notice how time responds to your awareness, the more you begin to see that what you thought was fixed may be far more flexible than it first appeared, and that the depth of your presence is not only shaping how you experience time, but how you experience reality itself within it. You have been moving through a world that appears silent, a world that seems to respond only through physical events, through cause and effect, through interactions that can be explained if you look closely enough. And yet there have been moments, subtle enough to dismiss if you choose, where something felt different, where an event did not feel isolated, where timing carried a precision that went beyond coincidence, where something seemed to answer a question you had not spoken aloud. And in those moments, even briefly, you sense that reality might not be as indifferent as it appears. I am not asking you to believe that the world is speaking to you in a literal voice. I am asking you to consider that what you experience may be part of an ongoing exchange, a dialogue that does not rely on language, but on pattern, timing, and meaning. A dialogue that becomes visible only when you are attentive enough to notice the connections that link seemingly unrelated events into something coherent. This is what is often called synchronicity, but the word itself does not capture the depth of what is happening, because it is not just coincidence with meaning attached. It is the reflection of a relationship between your inner state and the unfolding of external events. There was a man who spent his days trading goods in a crowded marketplace, and he began to notice something peculiar that did not fit into his understanding of randomness, because on days when he felt a sense of scarcity, when his attention was fixed on what might be lacking, his experience seemed to confirm that feeling in small but consistent ways. Fewer customers approached, exchanges felt strained, opportunities slipped past without fully forming. Yet on days when he felt a quiet appreciation, not forced, not exaggerated, but steady, his experience shifted in ways that were difficult to ignore. Unexpected customers appeared. Transactions flowed with ease. Small coincidences accumulated into a pattern that felt almost intentional. At first, he attributed these changes to external factors, to timing, to luck, to conditions he could not control. But the consistency of the pattern began to challenge that explanation, because the shift in his experience always followed a shift in his state, not the other way around. And as he became more aware of this relationship, he began to experiment in a way that did not involve changing his actions, but changing how he addressed the world itself. He started to treat his environment as if it were responsive, as if it were capable of receiving and reflecting his attention. And while this may have seemed unusual at first, the results became increasingly difficult to dismiss, because the more he engaged with his surroundings as if they were part of a living exchange, the more they appeared to respond with a kind of coherence that went beyond simple cause and effect. You have experienced something similar, even if only in passing. Moments when a thought was followed by an external confirmation, when a question formed internally and an answer appeared through an unexpected source, when a sequence of events aligned in a way that felt too precise to be random, and perhaps you dismissed these moments as coincidence, as pattern seeking, as the mind connecting things that were not truly connected. Yet what if those moments were not anomalies, but glimpses of a process that is always present, a process that becomes visible only when your awareness is attuned to it? The field you exist within is not passive. It is not merely a backdrop for your experiences. It is interactive, responsive, continuously reflecting patterns that correspond to your attention, your emotion, your expectation. And when these internal states reach a certain level of coherence, the reflection becomes more noticeable, more precise, more aligned with what you are holding within. This is why synchronicity often appears in clusters. Why one meaningful coincidence is often followed by another. Because once you are attuned to a certain pattern, you begin to perceive more of it. And as your perception deepens, the pattern itself seems to intensify. There was a traveler who found himself uncertain about a decision, not knowing which direction to take. And instead of forcing an answer, he allowed the question to remain open, carrying it with him without urgency. And over the course of a single day, he began to notice something unusual, fragments of information appearing in different contexts, a phrase overheard in passing, a symbol that caught his attention repeatedly, a conversation that seemed unrelated at first, but gradually revealed a connection to what he had been considering. And by the end of the day, the answer he had been seeking had formed not through a single moment of realization, but through a sequence of events that, when viewed together, carried a clarity that felt undeniable. This is how the dialogue unfolds, not through direct instruction, but through pattern, through alignment, through a series of reflections that only make sense when you recognize the connection between what you are holding internally and what is appearing externally. The field does not respond to isolated thoughts. It responds to sustained patterns, to states that are held long enough to create coherence. And when that coherence is present, the response becomes visible in ways that can no longer be easily dismissed. You are not separate from this exchange. You are participating in it continuously, whether you are aware of it or not, because every thought you sustain, every emotion you hold, every expectation you reinforce contributes to the pattern that is being reflected back to you. The difference is not in whether the dialogue exists, but in whether you are listening for it, whether you are noticing the subtle ways in which reality responds, whether you are willing to consider that what you experience is not random, but part of an ongoing interaction. This does not require belief. It requires attention, a willingness to observe without immediately explaining away what does not fit into your previous understanding, a willingness to notice the timing of events, the repetition of symbols, the alignment of circumstances that seem to carry meaning beyond their surface appearance. As you begin to do this, something shifts, not in the world itself, but in how you relate to it, because you are no longer moving through it as if it were silent. You are engaging with it as if it were responsive, and in that engagement, the patterns that were always present begin to reveal themselves more clearly. You may find that certain moments stand out more than others, that certain sequences of events feel charged with significance, not because they are extraordinary in isolation, but because of how they connect, how they reflect something you were already holding within you. And as you begin to recognize these moments, You develop a sensitivity to the dialogue itself, an awareness that allows you to see beyond the surface of events into the patterns that link them. Stay with that awareness, not as a conclusion, but as an ongoing observation, because the more you notice the way reality responds, the more you begin to see that you are not simply moving through a fixed world, but participating in a dynamic exchange, one that reflects your inner state in ways that are subtle, precise, and continuously unfolding. Whether you are paying attention to it or not, you have been taught, perhaps without realizing it, to grip life tightly, to hold your desires with tension, to watch outcomes with a kind of silent pressure, as if your attention alone must force reality into compliance. And in doing so, you may have noticed a strange pattern, that the more you strain toward a result, the more distant it appears, while at other times, when you were not trying to control anything, when your attention was lighter, less attached, things unfolded with a quiet ease that felt almost undeserved, as if life responded better when you stopped demanding that it obey you. This is where the observer state begins to reveal itself, not as withdrawal, not as indifference, but as a shift in position, a movement from being entangled in every thought and reaction to standing in a place where you can see them without immediately becoming them. And this distinction, subtle as it may seem, changes everything about how you interact with your own mind and with the world that reflects it. There was a man who found himself caught in a pattern of constant effort, always trying to improve, to fix, to control the direction of his life. And yet, despite his discipline, despite his attention to detail, something always felt strained, as if each result required more force than the last, until one day, not out of strategy but out of exhaustion, he stopped trying to manage every outcome. And in that pause, something unfamiliar emerged, a sense of space between his thoughts and his identity, a recognition that he did not have to follow every impulse, that he could observe his reactions without immediately acting on them. At first, this felt unnatural, almost irresponsible, because he had been conditioned to believe that control was necessary, that constant engagement was the only way to ensure progress. Yet as he remained in that space of observation, something began to shift. The intensity of his reactions softened. The urgency that had driven his actions began to dissolve. And in its place, a different kind of clarity emerged, one that did not come from forcing decisions, but from allowing them to arise without pressure. You may have experienced something similar in moments where you stepped back, even briefly, from a situation that once felt overwhelming, and in that distance, you saw it differently, not because the situation changed, but because your relationship to it did. The observer state does not remove you from life. It changes how you engage with it. It allows you to act without being consumed by what you are acting upon, to move without carrying the weight of every possible outcome. This is why detachment is often misunderstood, because it is not about not caring. It is about not clinging, not tying your sense of self to the immediate result, not allowing every fluctuation in circumstance to dictate your internal state. When you are attached, your emotions rise and fall with each outcome. Your sense of stability depends on things that are constantly changing, and this creates a cycle of effort and reaction that feels exhausting over time. When you are in the observer state, there is still engagement, still intention, still movement, but there is also space, a separation between who you are and what is happening. And within that space, something becomes possible that was not accessible before. There was an artist who struggled with perfection, who could not complete a piece without feeling that it needed more adjustment, more refinement, more control. And this constant interference prevented the work from ever reaching a natural conclusion, until she decided, not as a technique but as an experiment, to observe her own process without interfering, to watch the impulse to correct, to notice the tension that arose when something felt incomplete, and to remain present without immediately acting on it. What she discovered was unexpected, because as she allowed that space to exist, the work began to take on a coherence that had been missing before. Decisions emerged more clearly, not forced, not rushed, but aligned in a way that felt natural rather than imposed. This is the essence of effortless creation, not the absence of action, but the absence of resistance within action, a state where what you do is not driven by urgency or fear, but by clarity that arises when you are not entangled in every thought that passes through your mind. Effortless does not mean inactive. It means that your actions are not burdened by the need to control every variable, that you are responding rather than reacting, that you are moving from a place of awareness rather than compulsion. You are not your thoughts, but you have been living as if you are, following each one as it appears, allowing it to define your direction without question. And this creates a sense of instability, because thoughts are constantly changing, constantly shifting, and if you identify with each one, your sense of self becomes just as unstable. The observer state interrupts this pattern, not by stopping thoughts, but by changing your relationship to them, by allowing you to see them as events within your awareness rather than commands that must be followed. As you begin to rest more consistently in this state, something else becomes noticeable. The need to force outcomes begins to fade, not because you have given up on what you want, but because you no longer feel that tension is required to achieve it. You act when action is clear. You wait when waiting feels natural. And this balance creates a different kind of momentum, one that is not driven by pressure, but by alignment. There is a quiet confidence that emerges here, not loud, not demanding, but steady, because you are no longer trying to control every aspect of your experience. You are participating in it with awareness, allowing things to unfold while still engaging where it is appropriate. This does not guarantee specific outcomes, but it changes the quality of your experience entirely. It removes the constant strain of trying to manage what cannot be fully controlled, and replaces it with a sense of ease that does not depend on external conditions. Remain with this distinction, not as something to master immediately, but as something to notice in real time, because each moment offers you a choice: to become entangled or to observe, to react or to respond, to grip or to allow. And in that choice, repeated over time, the way you experience both yourself and the world begins to shift in ways that do not require force to be sustained. You may have noticed, even if only in quiet moments when you step back far enough to see your life as a whole, that certain patterns do not simply appear once and disappear. They return, wearing different faces, moving through different people, unfolding in different places, yet carrying a familiarity that is difficult to ignore, as if the same story is being told again with altered details but an unchanged structure beneath it. This repetition is not accidental, and it is not limited to major events. It exists in the subtle rhythms of your decisions, your reactions, your expectations, forming a kind of pattern that extends through time with a consistency that suggests something deeper is sustaining it. I want you to consider that what repeats is not the circumstance itself, but the pattern that generates it, a pattern that exists within your beliefs, not as ideas you consciously declare, but as structures you have accepted so fully that they operate without being questioned. These structures behave like fractals, repeating at different scales, expressing the same underlying design whether the situation is large or small, whether the context changes or remains the same, because the source of the pattern is not external. It is embedded in the way you interpret and respond to experience. There was a woman who found herself moving from one relationship to another, each time believing that this one would be different, that this time the outcome would not mirror the past. Yet over time she began to notice that despite the differences in personality, in circumstance, in setting, the same dynamics emerged, the same misunderstandings, the same emotional responses, the same sense of distance that eventually formed. At first, she attributed this to coincidence, to unfortunate timing, to the behavior of others, but the repetition became too consistent to ignore, and in a moment of clarity, she began to look not at the people involved, but at the pattern itself, at the structure that seemed to recreate itself regardless of who entered her life. What she discovered was not a single belief, but a network of assumptions, subtle expectations about connection, about worth, about what could or could not be sustained. And these assumptions were not always visible at the level of conscious thought. They revealed themselves in reactions, in interpretations, in the way she anticipated outcomes before they fully formed. As she began to see this, the pattern did not immediately disappear. but it became visible. And in that visibility, something changed, because what is seen clearly no longer operates in the same way as what remains hidden. This is the nature of fractal belief structures. They do not require your attention to continue. They replicate themselves through consistency, through repetition, through the reinforcement of the same interpretations over time. And because they operate across different areas of your life, they create the impression that separate events are unrelated, when in fact they are expressions of the same underlying design. You may see this in how challenges repeat in different forms, in how certain opportunities seem to remain just out of reach, in how similar conflicts arise in different environments, each instance appearing unique on the surface, yet carrying a familiar structure beneath it. There was a craftsman who spent years creating intricate designs, patterns that repeated at different scales, small shapes forming larger ones, each layer reflecting the same structure in a more complex form. And one day he realized that the patterns he created externally were not so different from the patterns he lived internally, because the same principles applied: repetition, scaling, consistency. And once a design was established, it would continue to express itself unless intentionally altered. This realization shifted how he approached both his work and his life, because he understood that changing the outcome required changing the pattern, not just adjusting the surface details. Breaking a repeating pattern does not begin with forcing different results. It begins with recognizing the structure that is producing those results. And this recognition requires a level of awareness that goes beyond observing what happens. It requires observing how you respond, how you interpret, how you anticipate, because these are the points where the pattern is being reinforced. If you only focus on the outcome, you remain at the level where the pattern has already expressed itself. But if you begin to notice the internal processes that precede the outcome, you start to see where the pattern is maintained. You may notice that certain thoughts arise in familiar ways, that certain emotional responses follow predictable paths, that certain expectations form automatically. And while this can feel limiting at first, it is also where the possibility of change exists, because once you can see the pattern as it forms, you are no longer fully contained within it. You do not need to eliminate every aspect of the pattern immediately, but you can begin to introduce variation, to respond differently in small ways, to question assumptions that were previously accepted without awareness. There was a moment in the life of the woman when she encountered a familiar situation, one that would have previously led to the same outcome, and instead of reacting as she always had, she paused, not to force a different response, but to observe the impulse itself, to notice the expectation that was forming, to see the pattern as it began to unfold. That pause did not change everything instantly, but it interrupted the automatic continuation of the pattern, and in that interruption, a different response became possible, not because she forced it, but because she was no longer fully identified with the pattern itself. This is how fractals begin to shift, not through sudden transformation, but through moments of awareness that introduce new possibilities into a structure that was previously repeating without variation. Over time, these moments accumulate, and the pattern begins to lose its stability, not because it is attacked, but because it is no longer being reinforced in the same way. New structures begin to form. New responses create new outcomes. And gradually, the repetition that once felt inevitable becomes less consistent, less dominant, replaced by patterns that reflect a different way of engaging with experience. You are not required to dismantle every belief at once, but you are capable of noticing the patterns that shape your life. And in that noticing, something subtle but significant changes, because what was once automatic becomes visible, what was once assumed becomes questionable, and what was once repeated without awareness begins to open to variation. The fractal nature of belief does not trap you. It reveals how patterns are sustained, and in that revelation, it also reveals how they can be transformed, not by force, but by the steady introduction of awareness into places where repetition once operated unnoticed. You have been told that probability is something external, something calculated through numbers, something that belongs to systems beyond your influence. And yet if you observe your own life closely, you will begin to see that outcomes do not distribute themselves evenly, that certain results appear with surprising consistency, while others remain distant, no matter how much effort is applied. And this uneven pattern suggests that probability, as you experience it, is not only a matter of chance, but something that responds to a deeper alignment within you, something that shapes which possibilities become more likely and which quietly fade from reach. I want you to consider that what you feel is not separate from what is possible, that your emotional state is not just a reaction to circumstances, but a form of alignment that influences how reality organizes itself around you. Because probability, at its core, is not a fixed set of outcomes waiting to occur. It is a field of potential that shifts in response to coherence, to consistency, to the dominant pattern you sustain internally over time. When your emotional state is fragmented, when it shifts between doubt and certainty, between desire and fear, the field reflects that fragmentation, producing inconsistent results, partial movements, outcomes that begin to form but do not stabilize. There was a man who approached his work with determination, setting clear goals, taking deliberate action, yet he carried within him a subtle tension, a quiet uncertainty about whether his efforts would be enough. And this uncertainty did not always appear in his thoughts, but it was present in his emotional state, in the way he anticipated outcomes, in the way he reacted to small setbacks. Over time, he began to notice a pattern. Opportunities would appear, progress would begin, and then something would shift, not dramatically, but enough to redirect the outcome, as if the initial movement could not sustain itself. He attributed this to external conditions, to timing, to factors beyond his control, until he began to notice that each interruption followed a similar internal shift, a moment where doubt replaced certainty, where tension replaced clarity. This observation did not immediately change his results, but it changed where he looked for the cause. And as he began to focus not only on what he was doing, but on what he was feeling while he was doing it, something became clearer. The consistency of his emotional state mattered more than the intensity of his effort. When he acted from a state of quiet confidence, not forced, not exaggerated, but steady, the results began to stabilize. Progress continued rather than stalling. Opportunities extended rather than collapsing. And while nothing external appeared dramatically different, the pattern of outcomes shifted in a way that could not be ignored. You may recognize this in your own experience. Moments when you felt aligned, when your actions flowed without resistance, when outcomes seemed to follow naturally, and other moments when effort felt heavy, when results were inconsistent, when progress seemed to require more force than it should. The difference is not always in what you do, but in the state from which you do it. Because your emotional alignment acts as a signal that influences which possibilities become more accessible to you. This is not about forcing yourself to feel something you do not feel, because anything forced lacks stability. It is about recognizing that sustained emotional coherence creates a kind of momentum, a consistency that allows certain outcomes to become more probable, not through control, but through alignment. When you hold a state of certainty, not as a rigid belief but as a steady feeling, you begin to notice that decisions become clearer, actions require less resistance, and the sequence of events that follows carries a coherence that was previously absent. There was a traveler who set out with a clear destination in mind. But what distinguished his journey was not just his direction, it was the way he carried that direction within him, not as a distant hope, but as a present certainty. And because of this, each step he took aligned with that certainty, not perfectly, not without variation, but consistently enough that obstacles did not derail him. They adjusted his path without altering his movement. Others who traveled similar paths often became uncertain when conditions changed, questioning their direction, hesitating, altering their course, and in doing so, they disrupted the continuity of their journey, making their destination less certain, not because it was unreachable, but because their alignment with it was inconsistent. Probability, in this sense, is not commanded through force, but through consistency, through the alignment of thought, emotion, and action over time, creating a pattern that the field responds to by organizing events in a way that reflects that alignment. When your internal state is coherent, when your expectations, your feelings, and your actions are not in conflict. The path toward a particular outcome becomes more stable, not guaranteed, but increasingly probable. Because you are not interrupting the process with opposing signals, you may begin to notice that small shifts in your emotional state have larger effects than you expected, that moments of doubt can disrupt momentum, that moments of clarity can restore it. And this is not because reality is fragile, but because it is responsive, adjusting continuously to the patterns you sustain. This responsiveness is often subtle. It does not announce itself. But over time, it becomes visible in the way outcomes cluster, in the way certain results become more frequent, more consistent, more aligned with the state you have been holding. There was a point in the man's journey when he realized that he did not need to control every variable, that his role was not to force outcomes into existence, but to maintain alignment with what he intended, to return to a state of clarity when it wavered, to notice when tension replaced confidence, and to allow that tension to settle without reinforcing it. This did not eliminate all challenges, but it changed how those challenges influenced the outcome, because they no longer disrupted his alignment in the same way. You are not separate from probability. You are interacting with it continuously, influencing it through the patterns you sustain, not through isolated moments of intensity, but through consistency over time. The question is not whether you can control every outcome, but whether you can recognize how your emotional state shapes the likelihood of those outcomes, how alignment increases coherence, how coherence increases stability, and how stability allows certain possibilities to become more accessible. Remain with that recognition, not as something to perfect, but as something to observe in real time, because each moment offers an opportunity to notice the state you are carrying, to see how it influences what follows, and in that awareness, the relationship between what you feel and what becomes possible begins to reveal itself with a clarity that does not require belief, only attention. You have been taught to trust what is direct, what can be measured, what can be explained in clear sequences of cause and effect. And yet there are moments that do not arrive in that form, moments that speak without using language, that present themselves as symbols, as repeated images, as fragments of meaning that seem to follow you without announcing why they matter. And if you move too quickly, you will miss them, because they do not force attention. They wait for it, appearing quietly, consistently, until you either recognize them or dismiss them as coincidence. I want you to notice something you may have overlooked. That meaning does not always arrive as a clear statement. It often comes encoded, not to hide itself, but because the mind you are used to relying on does not always receive truth in direct form. It resists, it analyzes, it interrupts, and so the deeper layers of communication move differently. They use symbols, patterns, repetition, allowing understanding to emerge gradually rather than being imposed all at once. This is why certain images or ideas seem to return to you, not once, but multiple times, in different contexts, through different channels, as if something is attempting to maintain your attention long enough for recognition to occur. There was a man who began to notice a particular symbol appearing in his life, not dramatically, not in a way that demanded explanation, but subtly, in places where he would not expect it. A shape in a reflection, a pattern in a piece of architecture, a fragment in a conversation that carried the same structure. And at first he ignored it, attributing it to chance, to the mind's tendency to notice repetition where none was intended. Yet the symbol persisted, appearing often enough that it became difficult to dismiss entirely. What changed was not the symbol itself, but his willingness to observe it without immediately explaining it away. And as he did, something began to unfold, not as a single answer, but as a gradual recognition, because each appearance of the symbol was connected to a moment in his life, a decision, a hesitation, a question that had not yet been resolved. The symbol was not giving him instructions. It was reflecting a pattern, pointing to something within him that required attention. And once he saw the connection, the repetition ceased, not because the world stopped presenting symbols, but because that particular message had been recognized, integrated, no longer needing to repeat in the same way. You have likely experienced something similar, though perhaps you have not named it as such. Moments where a word, A number, an image appears repeatedly, not in isolation, but in a sequence that feels connected. And while it may be tempting to search for a fixed meaning, to assign a universal definition to each symbol, the nature of this communication does not operate through static interpretation. It is relational. It reflects your state, your attention, your current position within your own experience. There was a traveler who found himself repeatedly encountering a certain phrase, spoken by different people in unrelated situations, written in places he had not noticed before, appearing at moments when he was uncertain about his direction, and instead of searching for an external meaning, he began to ask a different question. Not what does this phrase mean in general, but what does it reflect in me right now? What is present in my awareness when this appears? And through that shift, the phrase became less of a puzzle and more of a mirror, revealing the state he was carrying, the question he was avoiding, the direction he was hesitant to acknowledge. Symbols do not impose meaning. They reveal it, and they do so in a way that requires your participation, for your attention, your willingness to connect what appears externally with what is present internally. This is why two people can encounter the same symbol and derive completely different meanings from it, because the symbol itself is not fixed. It is a point of reflection, a surface upon which your current state becomes visible in a form that can be recognized if you are attentive enough. The field you are part of does not rely solely on direct communication. It uses layers. It uses repetition. It uses patterns that align with your perception. And when you begin to notice these patterns, you start to realize that what you once considered random may carry coherence, not in a way that can always be explained immediately, but in a way that becomes clearer as you observe without rushing to conclude. There was a moment when the man, who had once ignored the symbol, encountered it again at a point of decision, and this time he did not interpret it as a sign telling him what to do, but as an invitation to become aware of what he was already feeling, to notice the tension he had been avoiding, the uncertainty he had been suppressing. And in that awareness, the decision itself became clearer, not because the symbol dictated it, but because it revealed what had already been present beneath the surface. This is where the language of symbols becomes meaningful, not as a system to decode rigidly, but as a dynamic exchange that reflects your inner state in forms that can bypass resistance, that can reach you in ways that direct statements cannot. It does not require belief. It requires attention, a willingness to notice without immediately categorizing, to observe without forcing interpretation, to allow meaning to emerge rather than be imposed. You may begin to see that certain symbols appear at particular times, that their repetition coincides with specific states or questions, and as you track these patterns, not obsessively, but attentively, you develop a sensitivity to this form of communication, a recognition that what appears externally is often connected to what is unfolding internally. The world is not speaking in a single language. It is reflecting in many forms, and symbols are one of the ways this reflection becomes visible, not as answers given to you, but as mirrors offered to you, allowing you to see what you may not have been able to see directly. When you stop looking for fixed meanings and begin to observe the relationship between the symbol and your state, something shifts, because the communication is no longer external. It becomes participatory, something you are involved in rather than something you are trying to decipher from a distance. Stay with that awareness, not as a conclusion, but as a practice of noticing, because the more you recognize the patterns that appear around you, the more you begin to see that meaning is not imposed from outside. It is revealed through the interaction between your awareness and the forms that reflect it. And in that interaction, something becomes visible that was always present, waiting not to be explained, but to be seen. You have been moving through what appears to be a single, continuous reality, a fixed sequence of events that unfolds in one direction, one version of life that you assume is the only one available to you. And yet there are moments, subtle but undeniable, where something feels slightly out of alignment with that assumption. Moments where a different outcome seems just as possible as the one that actually occurred. Moments where a choice shifts the entire direction of what follows. And in those moments, if you are attentive enough, you begin to sense that reality may not be singular in the way you were taught to believe. I want you to consider that what you call reality is not a single path. but a convergence, a point where multiple possibilities overlap. And what you experience is the version that aligns most closely with the state you are holding, not as a conscious decision in every moment, but as a continuous alignment that selects one path among many. These paths do not disappear when you do not choose them. They remain as potential, as parallel structures that exist simultaneously, even if you only experience one at a time. There was a man who often found himself reflecting on the decisions he had made, wondering how different his life might have been if he had chosen differently at certain moments. And at first, these reflections felt like speculation, like imagining alternate scenarios that had no real existence. Yet something shifted when he began to notice that even in the present, small changes in his perception, in his state, seemed to alter the way events unfolded. Not dramatically, but consistently enough to suggest that he was not moving through a fixed path, but through a range of possibilities that responded to how he engaged with them. He began to experiment in a quiet way, not by changing external actions immediately, but by shifting his internal position, approaching the same situations with a different sense of expectation, a different emotional tone, and what he observed was subtle but clear. The same circumstances did not produce identical outcomes. Interactions took on a different quality. Opportunities appeared or receded depending on the state he carried into them. It was as if he was moving between slightly different versions of reality, not by physically changing his environment, but by aligning with a different layer of it. You have experienced something similar, even if you have not framed it this way. Moments when your day seemed to unfold smoothly, when everything aligned in a way that felt natural, and other days when the same environment, the same people, the same tasks felt resistant, misaligned, as if you were moving through a different version of the same world. The difference is not always in what is happening externally, but in the version of reality you are aligned with internally. This is the law of overlapping worlds, not a concept meant to complicate your understanding, but a way of describing something you already participate in. The idea that multiple versions of outcomes exist simultaneously, and your experience is determined by which version you are aligned with at any given moment. Alignment, in this sense, is not a single thought or intention. It is the consistency of your state, the coherence of your beliefs, your emotions, your expectations, all forming a pattern that corresponds to a particular version of reality. There was a traveler who reached a crossroads, not a dramatic one, but a simple choice between two paths. And while the physical decision seemed straightforward, what he noticed later was that the path he chose did not just lead to a different destination. It seemed to carry a different sequence of events, different encounters, different opportunities, as if each path contained its own narrative, its own structure that unfolded once he aligned with it. This realization did not make him feel that one path was right and the other wrong, but that each represented a different version of experience. And his choice was not just about direction, but about alignment with a particular unfolding. You are making similar selections continuously, not always through visible decisions, but through the state you sustain, because your state determines which layer of reality becomes accessible to you. When your state is aligned with clarity, with coherence, with a sense of possibility, the version of reality that reflects those qualities becomes more prominent, more available, more likely to be experienced. When your state is fragmented, uncertain, or constrained by limiting beliefs, the version of reality that reflects those patterns becomes the one you encounter. This does not mean that you are shifting between entirely separate worlds in a way that breaks continuity. It means that within the same framework of reality, there are overlapping possibilities, and your experience is the result of which possibility you align with most consistently. The overlap is constant, the selection is continuous, and the process is subtle enough that it feels natural, as if reality is simply unfolding, when in fact it is responding to the patterns you sustain. There was a moment when the man recognized that he did not need to force himself into a different life, that he did not need to escape his current circumstances to experience change, because the shift was not about location. It was about alignment, about the version of reality he was engaging with through his state. As he began to adjust that alignment, not perfectly, but consistently, the changes in his experience became more noticeable, not as sudden transformations, but as shifts in direction, in quality. In the sequence of events that followed, you may begin to see that what you experience is not the only version available, that within your current life there are multiple trajectories, multiple ways events can unfold, and your state acts as the filter that determines which trajectory becomes dominant. This realization does not remove uncertainty, but it reframes it, because uncertainty is no longer just unpredictability. It is the presence of multiple possibilities, waiting to be aligned with. Remain with this understanding, not as something to force into immediate application, but as something to observe, because as you notice how your state influences the version of reality you experience, you begin to see that change does not always require external effort. It often begins with internal alignment, with the recognition that the world you move through is not singular, but layered, responsive, and continuously shaped by the patterns you sustain within it. You close your eyes at night and enter a world that feels separate from the one you call real, a place where logic loosens, where time bends without resistance, where identities shift and scenes unfold without the constraints you accept during the day. And yet when you wake, you tend to dismiss that entire experience as illusion, as something unreal, something disconnected from the life you return to each morning, without pausing to consider that the boundary between these states may not be as absolute as it appears. What if the dream is not an escape from reality, but another layer of it? One that reveals aspects of your consciousness that remain hidden when your attention is fixed on the external world. I want you to notice how differently you exist in a dream, how you move without questioning the environment, how you accept changes in identity, how you experience events without the same resistance that you would bring into waking life, and how, within that state, possibilities unfold with a fluidity that seems inaccessible when you are fully awake. This is not because the dream is less real, but because your relationship to it is different. Your awareness is less constrained by the structures you have learned to maintain. And in that openness, something becomes visible that is always present but rarely accessed with the same freedom. There was a man who began to pay attention to his dreams, not in the sense of analyzing every detail, but in observing the feeling of being within them, the sense of immediacy, the way events unfolded without the need for control. And what he discovered was not a series of random images, but patterns that reflected his waking life in symbolic form, scenarios that mirrored his concerns, his desires, his unresolved questions, presented in ways that bypassed the filters of logic and expectation. Over time, he noticed that the emotional tone of his dreams often preceded changes in his waking experience, not in a direct, predictable way, but in subtle shifts that suggested a connection between these states. You have likely experienced dreams that felt significant, not because of their content alone, but because of how they lingered, how they carried a certain clarity or intensity that remained with you after waking. And while it is easy to dismiss these experiences, there is something within them that points to a broader understanding of self, one that is not limited to a single identity moving through a single reality, but something more layered, more expansive, capable of existing across different states of awareness. This is where the idea of the multiverse within begins to emerge, not as a distant concept involving external worlds, but as an internal landscape where multiple versions of self exist, not simultaneously in the way the mind tries to imagine, but as potentials, as variations of identity that can be accessed depending on the state you inhabit. In your waking life, you operate within a relatively stable version of yourself, shaped by memory, by habit, by the continuity of experience. Yet even within that stability, you shift, you adapt, you respond differently depending on context, revealing that your identity is not fixed, but fluid within certain boundaries. In the dream state, those boundaries loosen, allowing other aspects of self to emerge, aspects that may not align with your waking identity, yet still belong to the broader structure of who you are. There was a traveler who began to notice that in his dreams, he often took on roles he would not assume in waking life, speaking with a confidence he did not always feel, moving through environments with a sense of familiarity that did not exist in his daily experience. And instead of dismissing these as fantasies, he began to ask what they revealed, not about the world, but about himself, about the parts of his identity that were present but not fully expressed when he was awake. As he explored this, something unexpected happened. The qualities he experienced in his dreams began to influence his waking life, not through conscious effort, but through a subtle shift in how he saw himself, as if the version of him that existed in the dream had left an imprint that could be accessed even when he was fully awake. This did not transform everything instantly, but it introduced a new possibility, a recognition that his identity was not limited to what he had previously assumed. You may begin to notice that the line between these states is not as rigid as it seems, that the emotional tone of your dreams can influence how you feel when you wake, that insights can emerge in states where your mind is less constrained, and that these insights can carry into your waking experience if you are attentive enough to recognize them. The dream is not separate from your life. It is part of the same continuum of awareness, another layer through which your consciousness expresses and explores itself. There was a moment when the man realized that he did not need to control his dreams to benefit from them, that simply paying attention, allowing them to be as they were, created a connection that had not existed before. And through that connection, he began to see patterns that linked his inner world across different states, patterns that revealed consistencies, shifts, and possibilities that were not visible when he only considered his waking experience. You are not confined to a single version of yourself, even if it feels that way most of the time, because your identity is not a fixed structure. It is a dynamic pattern that can express itself differently depending on the state you are in. And as you become more aware of these variations, you begin to understand that change does not always require external action. It can begin with recognizing and integrating aspects of yourself that are already present, but not fully acknowledged. The multiverse within is not something you need to reach. It is something you are already part of, a range of possibilities that exist within your own consciousness, accessible in different ways depending on how you engage with your awareness. The dream state is one of those access points, not because it is separate, but because it allows certain boundaries to dissolve, revealing what remains hidden when those boundaries are firmly in place. Remain with this recognition, not as a conclusion, but as an invitation to observe more closely, to notice how your sense of self shifts across different states, how insights can emerge when your awareness is less constrained, and how these insights can influence the way you experience your waking life, not through force, but through the gradual expansion of what you recognize as possible within yourself. You move through spaces that appear shared, environments filled with other people, other intentions, other movements that seem independent of you. And yet there are moments when the atmosphere of a place feels unmistakable before anything is said, when you can sense tension or ease without needing evidence, when the emotional tone of a room reaches you instantly. And if you pause long enough to notice, you begin to realize that what you are sensing is not abstract. It is a form of influence, something transmitted without words, something that exists beneath visible interaction and shapes how experiences unfold collectively. I want you to consider that emotion is not contained within the boundaries of your body, that it is not limited to private experience, but functions as a kind of frequency, a pattern of coherence that extends outward, interacting with the environment and with others in ways that are subtle but continuous. This is not about imagining invisible forces without basis. It is about observing how states influence interaction, how a single person's presence can shift the tone of an entire space, how collective moods form without explicit coordination, and how these shared states begin to guide behavior, perception, and outcome. There was a woman who worked in a place where many people gathered each day, and she noticed that the atmosphere of the space would change depending on what individuals carried into it, not in obvious ways at first, but in small shifts that accumulated. A slight increase in tension when someone entered in a state of agitation, a noticeable ease when someone arrived with calm attention, and over time, these individual states blended into a collective tone that influenced how everyone interacted, how decisions were made, how conflicts arose or dissolved. She began to see that what people felt did not remain isolated. It contributed to a shared field that everyone participated in, whether they were aware of it or not. You have experienced this without naming it, entering a conversation already shaped by an unspoken tension, feeling the weight of an environment before understanding its cause, or sensing a sense of openness that made interaction easier without any clear reason. These are not random impressions. They are responses to the frequencies present, to the emotional patterns that are being sustained collectively and transmitted through subtle cues that your awareness picks up, even when your mind does not analyze them directly. This is where the idea of vibrational influence becomes practical rather than abstract, because it is not about assigning mystical properties to emotion. It is about recognizing that what you sustain internally contributes to the environment you are part of, that your state is not neutral. It participates in shaping the collective experience. When you hold tension, that tension is not silent. It influences how you speak, how you move, how you interpret others, and these effects ripple outward, interacting with the states of those around you, creating patterns that reinforce or shift the overall tone. There was a man who often found himself in situations where conflict seemed inevitable, conversations that escalated quickly, misunderstandings that intensified rather than resolved. And he believed this was simply the nature of the environments he was in, until he began to observe his own state more closely, noticing that he often entered these situations already anticipating resistance, already holding a subtle defensiveness that shaped how he engaged. When he shifted this, not by forcing a different outcome, but by becoming aware of the tension he carried and allowing it to settle before interaction, something changed. Not immediately in every case, but often enough to reveal a pattern. Conversations became less reactive, responses more measured. The same environments began to produce different outcomes. This is not because others suddenly changed, but because the field of interaction had shifted. The frequency he contributed was different, and that difference influenced how others responded, how the collective dynamic unfolded. You may begin to see that influence does not require dominance. It does not require control. It operates through alignment, through the consistency of the state you maintain, through the way that state interacts with the environment around you. There was a gathering where many people came together with different intentions, different expectations, and at first the atmosphere felt fragmented, disjointed. But as a few individuals settled into a steady, calm presence, not imposed, not forced, something began to shift. Conversations slowed, attention deepened, the overall tone became more cohesive, and while no single person directed this change, the influence of consistent states began to organize the collective experience in a different way. This is how collective reality forms, not through a single force, but through the interaction of many individual states, each contributing to the overall pattern. You are part of this process continuously, influencing and being influenced at the same time. And while you may not control the entire field, you contribute to it in ways that matter, because consistency has an effect, coherence has an effect, and over time, these effects accumulate, shaping not only your personal experience, but the shared environments you move through. You may notice that certain groups carry distinct atmospheres, that certain places feel different, even when the physical structure is the same. And this difference is not only in what is visible, it is in what is sustained emotionally, in the patterns of interaction that develop and reinforce themselves over time. When you enter these environments, you interact with those patterns. You either align with them or introduce variation, and in doing so, you participate in the ongoing formation of the collective state. This does not mean that you must always maintain a particular emotion, or that you are responsible for the entire environment. But it does mean that your state is not insignificant, that it contributes to something larger than your individual experience. When you become aware of this, your attention shifts, not toward controlling others, but toward understanding how what you carry influences what unfolds, how your presence affects interaction, how consistency in your state can create stability even within changing conditions. Remain with this awareness, not as a rule to follow, but as something to observe in real time. Because the more you notice how states interact, how environments respond, how collective patterns form and shift, the more you begin to see that reality is not only individual, it is shared, shaped continuously by the frequencies that are present within it. And in that recognition, your role within that process becomes clearer without needing to be defined in rigid terms. You stand more often than you realize at the edge of something not yet defined, a space between what has already taken form and what has not yet revealed itself. And in that space there is usually a subtle tension, not always dramatic, but present enough to influence how you move, because the mind has been trained to prefer what is known, to rely on what has already been experienced, to measure safety through familiarity. And when you find yourself in transition, when the path ahead is not clearly mapped, that conditioning becomes visible in the form of hesitation, doubt, the quiet impulse to return to what you understand, even if it no longer aligns with where you are meant to go. I want you to notice that this space, this undefined middle, is not empty in the way it appears. It is not a void where nothing exists. It is a bridge, invisible not because it is absent, but because it does not take the form you expect. It cannot be fully seen from the position you are standing in, and yet it is already present, already forming beneath your awareness, shaped by the direction you have begun to move toward, even if you cannot yet see how it will support you. There was a man who found himself leaving behind a life that had once felt stable, a structure that had defined his identity, his routines, his expectations, and while part of him recognized that he could not remain there, another part resisted the movement forward, not because the future was necessarily threatening, but because it was undefined, lacking the certainty that his mind had come to depend on. He stood for a long time in that space between, trying to calculate each step before taking it, trying to ensure that the path ahead would be secure. But the more he attempted to define it completely, the less clear it became, because what he was seeking could not be fully known in advance. It was only when he shifted his approach, not by abandoning caution, but by allowing movement without full visibility, that something changed. And as he took steps forward without demanding complete certainty, he began to notice that the path did not appear all at once, but in segments, each step revealing the next, each movement creating conditions that were not present before. The bridge did not exist in its entirety before he began. It formed as he moved, not randomly, but in response to his willingness to continue despite not seeing the full structure. You have experienced moments like this, even if you did not name them, times when you could not see how something would unfold. Yet you moved anyway, and in that movement, clarity emerged gradually, not as a complete picture, but as a sequence of realizations that made the next step possible. This is the nature of transition, not a sudden shift from one state to another, but a process that unfolds through engagement with the unknown, through a kind of trust that is not blind, but based on the recognition that not everything can be known before it is lived. Trust, in this sense, is not belief without evidence. It is a relationship with the process itself, a willingness to remain present within uncertainty without collapsing into fear or retreating into what is already familiar. It does not eliminate doubt entirely, but it changes how you respond to it, allowing you to continue moving even when doubt arises, rather than allowing it to stop you completely. There was a traveler who approached a region where the path disappeared into dense terrain, and while others turned back, unwilling to proceed without a clear route, he remained, observing, not rushing forward blindly, but also not retreating. And as he stayed with that uncertainty, small indicators began to appear, subtle signs of direction, variations in the landscape that suggested where movement was possible. And by following these small indications, rather than waiting for a fully defined path, he was able to move through a space that initially seemed impassable. The path was not given to him in advance. It revealed itself through his engagement with it. This is how the invisible bridge functions, not as a fixed structure that you can examine before crossing, but as something that responds to your movement, to your attention, your willingness to step into what is not yet fully known. The unknown is not an absence of structure. It is a space where structure has not yet been revealed to you, and the act of moving within it is what allows that structure to become visible. You may notice that the more you try to force certainty in these moments, the more resistance you encounter, because certainty in its complete form is not always available at the beginning of a transition. What is available is direction, a sense of movement, an indication of where to step next. And when you align with that, rather than demanding a full map, the process begins to unfold with a different kind of coherence. There was a point in the man's journey where he realized that waiting for complete clarity had been a way of avoiding movement. that his desire for certainty was not always about safety, but about control, about trying to guarantee an outcome before engaging with it. And once he saw this, he began to shift his relationship with the unknown, not seeing it as something to eliminate, but as something to move through, something that would reveal itself in proportion to his willingness to engage with it. You are not required to see the entire path before you begin, but you are capable of recognizing when you are being called to move, when something within you indicates direction, even if the details are not yet defined. And in those moments, the question is not whether you can guarantee the outcome, but whether you can remain present enough to take the next step without needing the entire structure to be visible. The bridge you are standing on may not appear solid when you look ahead, but as you move, you may begin to notice that each step holds, that the structure is forming in response to your engagement, not in a way that removes all uncertainty, but in a way that supports your movement through it. This does not eliminate risk, but it reframes it, because you are no longer trying to avoid the unknown entirely. You are learning to move within it with awareness. Remain with this understanding, not as a final answer, but as something to observe in your own experience. Because each transition you encounter offers an opportunity to see how you relate to what is not yet defined, how you respond to the absence of complete clarity, and how, through that response, the path ahead begins to take form in ways that cannot be fully seen until you are already moving within them. What you have been searching for has never been located at a distance from you, not hidden in a place you must reach, not contained in a future moment that will finally arrive and resolve everything, but present in a way that is easy to overlook precisely because it does not stand apart from you. It does not announce itself as something separate to be found. It is woven into the very experience through which you have been trying to understand it. And the reason it has seemed distant is not because it is far, but because you have been looking at it as if it were other than you. You have moved through each part of this exploration as if you were observing something external, as if there were a field, a force, a structure that you needed to learn how to interact with, to influence, to align with. And that perspective has been useful, because it allowed you to notice patterns, to observe relationships, to see how your state influences what unfolds. But there comes a point where that separation no longer holds, where the distinction between you and what you have been observing begins to dissolve, not as an idea, but as a direct recognition. I want you to pause and consider this carefully, not as something to accept, but as something to notice, that every experience you have had, every observation, every pattern you have recognized, has occurred within your awareness, not outside of it, not separate from it, but within it, and what you have been calling the field, the environment, the external world, has always been known to you through this awareness, never apart from it. This is not a philosophical statement. It is a direct fact of experience, one that becomes clearer the more closely you examine it. There was a man who spent years studying the nature of reality, exploring different ideas, different frameworks, trying to understand how the world functioned, how his thoughts influenced outcomes, how patterns formed and repeated. And for a long time he approached this as a relationship between himself and something external, something he needed to master or understand from a distance. Over time, however, a subtle shift occurred, not through a sudden realization, but through the accumulation of observations, because he began to notice that every time he tried to locate the boundary between himself and what he was observing, he could not find it in direct experience. He could think about it. He could describe it. But when he looked for it directly, it was not there in the way he expected. What he found instead was that what he called himself and what he called the world were not separate in the way he had assumed. They were aspects of a single experience, differentiated in thought, but not divided in actuality. This did not mean that distinctions disappeared in a practical sense. He still interacted with others, still moved through environments, still made decisions, but the underlying sense of separation began to soften, replaced by a recognition that what he experienced was not happening to him from the outside. But within the same field of awareness that he was, you may begin to notice something similar if you look without trying to force a conclusion, that what you perceive as external is always appearing within your awareness, that there is no experience you have that exists outside of it, and that the sense of separation you have relied on is constructed through interpretation rather than directly experienced as an absolute boundary. This does not negate the world. It reframes your relationship to it, because the field you have been interacting with is not separate from the awareness through which you know it. There was a moment when the man stopped trying to control his experience in the way he had before, not because he lost interest, but because he saw that the effort to control came from the assumption of separation, from the idea that he needed to manipulate something outside of himself to achieve a desired outcome. And as that assumption loosened, his approach changed, not into passivity, but into a different kind of engagement, one that did not rely on force, but on alignment, not as a strategy, but as a natural expression of recognizing that he was not separate from what he experienced. You may have noticed that when you are most at ease, when you are not resisting what is present, when you are fully engaged without tension, there is a sense of flow, a continuity that does not feel divided. And while this state may come and go, it offers a glimpse of what it is like when the sense of separation is less dominant, when you are not positioned against the world, but within it in a way that feels seamless. This is not something that needs to be achieved as a final state. It is something that can be noticed in moments, in the way experience unfolds when you are not imposing division where it does not need to exist. The collapse of separation is not a dramatic event. It is a quiet recognition that what you have been trying to connect with has never been apart from you, that the field is not something you enter or leave. It is the context within which everything you experience appears. There was no final answer given to the man, no conclusion that ended his exploration, only a shift in how he related to what he experienced, a recognition that removed the need to search in the way he had before, because what he had been seeking was already present, not as an object to be found, but as the very nature of the awareness through which he had been searching. You are not separate from the patterns you observe, from the field you sense, from the reality you experience. And while this may not change the details of your life immediately, it changes the position from which you engage with those details, removing the underlying tension of separation, allowing a different kind of clarity to emerge, one that does not depend on reaching a conclusion, but on recognizing what has always been here. Remain with that recognition, not as something to finalize, but as something that continues to unfold as you observe more closely. Because what appears as an ending is not a closure. It is simply a point where the search changes direction, no longer moving outward in the same way, but settling into a depth that was always present, waiting to be noticed without needing to be named.